I used to believe that love could survive anything, even cruelty. But the day my son looked at me with disdain rather than love, I realized I had been wrong all along. The silence in my house had changed over the years. It was no longer the peaceful hush of a quiet home. It became heavy, bitter like the air thickens before a storm. I sat on the edge of the same old floral couch I had bought with my late husband 40 years ago, hands clasped tight to keep them from trembling. The TV murmured in the background, but I wasn't watching. I was waiting. It had started so subtly. At first, it was just a sigh, a sharp, irritated exhale when I asked a question. Then it became muttered replies, curt commands, long stretches of silence where warmth should have been. And soon after, the smiles stopped coming. Then the words sharp as knives started cutting. Why do you have to be so slow, Mom? You always forget. What's the point of telling you anything? Just stay out of the way. That last one stuck with me. My son, Daniel, moved back into my home 15 years ago. He had just gone through a rough divorce, lost his job, and was reeling from a custody battle he ultimately lost. I welcomed him with open arms, my heart aching for his pain. I thought I could help him heal. I thought he needed me. But somewhere along the way, his pain turned into poison and I became his easiest target. I didn't realize I was walking on eggshells until they started cracking beneath me. I held back my opinions, kept my stories short, stopped offering advice. I thought maybe if I just stayed quiet enough, small enough, he would find his way back to the boy I raised, the kind boy with a crooked smile and a love for drawing dinosaurs in the margins of his school notebooks. But that boy never came back. Instead, the man who stood in my kitchen was a shadow of that child. He didn't hit me. No, that would have been easier to name. Instead, he rolled his eyes when I talked, slammed doors when he was annoyed, berated me for forgetting things, accused me of ruining his life every time something went wrong. Do you have to breathe so loud? He snapped once when I was eating soup at the dinner table. That night, I cried silently into my pillow, biting the corner of the sheet to muffle the sobs. I was 76 years old. I had lived through war, buried my husband, raised a child on my own. And yet, here I was afraid in my own home. The thing about psychological abuse is that it's invisible. There were no bruises, no police reports, no neighbors hearing screams through the walls. Just me and my shame. Because that's what it becomes, shame. You start to believe you're the problem. You tell yourself he's just stressed, that he's hurting, that it will pass. I told myself that every year. For 15 years. My friends dwindled. I stopped going to book club. I missed church for weeks, then months. Every time someone asked me how things were at home, I lied. I said Daniel was trying his best, that he was just having a hard time. I didn't realize I had disappeared until I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror one morning. My eyes looked tired, as if life itself had been slowly wrung out of them. My body had shrunk somehow, not in size, but in presence. I barely took up space. And I remembered my husband, Thomas. How he used to rest his hand on the small of my back in the kitchen as I cooked. How he'd whisper, "You make this house a home, Eliza." And how he made me feel seen. Daniel hadn't called me Mom in years. Just you. You left the light on again. You forgot to buy the coffee I like. You're the reason I can't get any peace. One morning, I forgot to start the dishwasher. I had simply forgotten. When Daniel came downstairs and saw the sink full of yesterday's dishes, he slammed his hand down so hard on the counter, I thought the granite would crack. "Are you completely useless now?" he hissed. Something snapped in me. Not a loud break, no. More like a hairline fracture that had been forming for years finally, giving way under pressure. I stood frozen, staring at the plates in the sink, his words ringing in my ears. Useless. Later that night, I sat in bed, the lamp casting a soft glow on my worn journal. I hadn't written in it in over a decade. But that night, I opened it to a blank page and wrote, "I am not useless. I am not what he says I am." I don't know where the words came from. Maybe from the part of me that still remembered who I was. The part that hadn't completely disappeared. I started writing every night. Not much, just thoughts. Little reminders. Memories of who I had been, what I had survived. I wrote about the birth of my son, the way he had wrapped his tiny fingers around mine. I wrote about teaching him how to ride a bike. About baking lemon squares for his elementary school bake sale. About the night I stayed up with him when he had the flu and sang old jazz tunes softly until he fell asleep. I wrote about my worth. And then I started remembering the things I loved. I went back to church. Quietly at first, slipping in after the service began, sitting in the back. I visited the library and checked out books. I took long walks in the park near the edge of town and listened to the birds. Daniel noticed. Of course he did. "You've been acting strange," he said one day, squinting at me over his coffee mug. "Going out all the time. Meeting people. What's the point?" I didn't answer. But inside me, something stirred. The final straw came on a Wednesday. I had baked his favorite banana bread with walnuts. Set it on the table like always. He came in late from whatever job he was holding at the time, and when he saw it, he frowned. "I don't like walnuts anymore," he muttered. "Are you even listening when I talk?" I stared at him. At the man who once clung to my leg on the first day of kindergarten, afraid to let go. At the man who now looked at me like I was an annoyance, a burden. My hands were trembling, but my voice was steady. "You can make your own next time," I said softly. He looked up, surprised. His mouth opened probably to unleash another complaint, but I walked away before he could say it. That night, I called Ruth, an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. We talked for 3 hours. She cried when I told her everything. And then she said something I'll never forget. "Eliza, you deserve peace. Even now. Especially now." That night, I began packing a small suitcase. Only the essentials: clothes, medications, my journal, a picture of Thomas, and a printed bus ticket. I didn't sleep much, but I wasn't afraid. I was free. The next morning, I left a note. "Daniel, I love you. I always will. But I won't let myself disappear. I am going to live what's left of my life, and I hope someday you find healing too." I didn't slam the door when I left. I closed it gently. I didn't look back. And for the first time in 15 years, I walked into the morning light not as someone's mother or caregiver or ghost, but as Eliza. The bus ride out of town was quiet. I sat by the window, clutching my worn leather purse in my lap, the small suitcase at my feet. The countryside passed in long, green blurs. Every bump in the road jarred loose another memory, some warm, some bitter, all still stitched into the fabric of who I was. I didn't cry. I thought I would. But there was only calm, a soft, almost sacred silence inside me, like the quiet after a storm has passed. I was heading to Ruth's house, 2 towns away. She lived in a small white cottage with a front porch and a backyard full of lavender. I had visited years ago, when Thomas was still alive. I remembered thinking it looked like something out of a painting, peaceful, safe. When the bus pulled into the station, Ruth was waiting. Her hair had gone fully gray, pulled back into a long braid, and she was wearing one of those bright, flowy scarves she always loved. The moment our eyes met, I felt something in my chest loosen. "Eliza," she said, pulling me into an embrace. "You're here." And just like that, I wasn't alone anymore. Ruth didn't ask for details that first night. She just showed me the guest room, made us some chamomile tea, and sat with me on the porch as the sun dipped behind the hills. We watched the light fade into gold, then blue, then nothing. "You don't have to talk until you're ready," she said. "But you don't have to be silent anymore, either." That night, I slept like I hadn't in years. Over the next few days, I began to breathe again. Truly breathe. My body ached less. My thoughts were clearer. The constant buzzing tension in my chest, the one I'd lived with for over a decade, slowly began to ease. Every morning, I'd wake up early, sit by the kitchen window with a cup of tea, and write. I didn't always know what to say. Some mornings, I wrote about the weather. Other times, I dug deep into the shame, the fear, the guilt, into the loss. Because there had been so much loss, hadn't there? Not just my husband, but my sense of worth, my voice, my right to peace. Ruth would check in with a gentle, "How's your heart this morning?" And I'd tell her what I could. Sometimes, I couldn't say much. But she never pushed. She simply gave me space, something I hadn't known I needed until it was finally mine. One afternoon, as we were folding laundry together, she looked at me and said, "You know, Eliza, what you did walking away, that takes more strength than people realize." I paused, holding a towel in my hands. "I don't feel strong," I admitted. "You don't have to feel it for it to be true," she said. That stayed with me. One morning, about 2 weeks after I'd arrived, I got a call from Daniel. I recognized the number, and for a moment, my thumb hovered over the answer button. My stomach tightened, my hands went cold. But I answered. "Mom," his voice was flat. "Where are you?" 100 responses came to mind, but I kept my tone calm. "I'm safe, Daniel." He exhaled, not relief, but frustration. You just left. Do you have any idea how that looks? I came home, and you were gone. Do you know how that made me feel? I almost laughed. Not out of cruelty, but disbelief. For years, he hadn't once asked how I felt. But now that I'd removed myself from his reach suddenly, he felt something. I left because I had to, I said softly. He was quiet. Then, you're being dramatic. I never hurt you. And there it was. The line I had heard 1,000 times. The denial. The refusal to name what was real. You didn't have to hit me to hurt me, Daniel, I said, my voice trembling but firm. He scoffed. So what? Now you're the victim? I closed my eyes. I didn't call to fight. I just want you to know I'm okay. But I won't be coming back. Not right now. So that's it. His voice cracked. You're abandoning me? That word abandoning hit me like a slap. Because that was what he truly believed. That my purpose was to stay. To endure. I loved you through everything, I whispered. But I won't love you at the cost of myself anymore. I hung up. And this time, I did cry. Not because I regretted leaving, but because it hurt to accept that my son, the person I had given everything to, might never understand the damage he had done. That call changed something in me. I realized that part of me had still been waiting, hoping, even that he would apologize. That he would wake up one day and say, Mom, I'm sorry for what I did to you. But he didn't. Maybe he never would. And I had to grieve that. I had to let go of the fantasy that he would suddenly become the person I needed him to be. Ruth helped me through that grief. She sat with me on the harder days, when my body felt heavy and my heart felt hollow. She made sure I ate. She took me on walks. She reminded me, over and over, that my life still held value. You get to choose what happens next, she said one evening as we watched the stars come out. You're not done, Eliza. You're just beginning again. Weeks turned into months. I began volunteering at the local library, organizing books, reading aloud to children on Tuesday mornings. At first, I was nervous. My voice trembled. My hands fumbled the pages. But soon, I found rhythm again. Joy even. The children laughed at my voices. One little girl hugged me after a story and said, You sound like a grandma. It made me cry. I started attending a women's circle at the church. Most of them were widows, some divorced, some also estranged from their children. I wasn't alone. I had never been, I just hadn't known where to look. One woman, Gloria, had a son who hadn't spoken to her in over a decade. Another, Bernice, had raised her grandson while her daughter battled addiction. Each of us carried pain, but we also carried one another. We held space for tears. We celebrated little victories. We became a lifeline. And somewhere along the way, I began to feel whole. It was during one of those meetings that I shared my story. All of it. The silence. The small cruelties. The loneliness. The moment I walked out. When I finished, no one said anything for a moment. Then Gloria reached across the table and took my hand. You did what so many of us were too afraid to do, she said. You chose yourself. That's not selfish. That's sacred. I wept. For the woman I had been. For the years I had lost. And for the life I was finally building. By the time spring arrived, I had found a rhythm. I rented a small room in town, not far from Ruth. It wasn't much, just a bedroom, a kitchenette, and a window that overlooked the park. But it was mine. Every inch of it was chosen. I decorated it with flowers, soft rugs, and pictures of Thomas. I even hung up a small canvas I painted in an art class Ruth had dragged me to. And every morning, I stood by the window, tea in hand, watching the world begin again. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I wasn't waiting for anything. I was living. For the first time in years, I belonged to myself. Spring unfolded slowly, like a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The days grew longer, warmer. The little park across from my apartment came alive with children's laughter, cherry blossoms, and elderly couples walking hand in hand. I sat by the window each morning, journal open, heart still tender but no longer raw. I began keeping a small list, things I loved that I forgot I loved. The smell of lavender after rain. The feel of sun-warmed stone under my palm. Jazz music drifting through an open window. The weight of a library book in my bag. Laughing until my cheeks hurt. And slowly my list grew. One Wednesday morning, as I was walking home from the farmer's market with a bag full of ripe peaches, I saw an older man sitting alone on a bench. He was feeding breadcrumbs to the pigeons, humming something soft and sweet. I smiled and kept walking. But the next week, he was there again. Same spot. Same gentle tune. We eventually struck up a conversation. His name was Henry, a retired music teacher, widowed, kind eyes and stories that spilled from him like well-worn records, a little scratchy, but full of soul. We spoke about music, about books, about grief. It wasn't romantic. Not at first, but it was safe, easy. He didn't ask too many questions. He didn't flinch when I told him, softly, that my son and I no longer spoke. He simply nodded and said, "Sometimes peace costs more than we want it to, but it's always worth the price." In early summer, I received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope, my name written in Daniel's familiar, slanted handwriting. My hands trembled as I held it. I didn't open it right away. I made tea. I sat by the window. I breathed. And then, I opened it. "Mom, I don't really know what to say." At first, I was angry. I felt abandoned. But after a while, after the silence set in, I started thinking about all the things I'd said over the years. The way I spoke to you. The way I treated you. You didn't deserve that. I've been talking to someone, a counselor. I know that probably sounds like too little too late. And maybe it is. But I wanted to tell you that I'm trying to understand what I became. I want you to know that I remember who you were to me. How you carried me through every storm, even when I tried to push you away. I'm sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me. But if you ever feel ready, I'd like to hear from you. Love, Daniel. I read the letter 3 times. Then once more aloud. I cried, not because the words erased the past, but because they finally named it. For the first time in years, I felt seen by the person who had spent so long making me feel invisible. I didn't respond right away. I needed time. I needed to understand what I wanted, not just what he needed. And the truth was, I didn't know. Not yet. I took the letter to Ruth. We sat in her garden, bees buzzing lazily around us, sun warming our faces. She read it quietly, then looked up. "How does it feel?" I thought for a long time. "Like air returning to a room," I said. "But I'm not sure if I want to stay in that room anymore." "You don't have to," she said. "Closure doesn't always mean reunion." That night, I wrote in my journal, "I'm allowed to heal without going back. I'm allowed to forgive without reopening the door." I placed the letter in a small wooden box where I kept important things, old photos, Thomas's wedding band, a pressed flower from the day I moved into my apartment. It belonged there, not forgotten, but no longer dictating the present. By July, Henry and I had become regulars at the Sunday farmers market. He'd carry the heavier bags. I'd pick the ripest tomatoes. We shared stories over coffee, walked slowly along the river path, watched fireflies in the park. One evening, he brought me a small gift, a vintage record of Billie Holiday. "I thought you'd appreciate the ache in her voice," he said. And I did. He never tried to fix me. Never asked me to be anything other than what I was, a woman in the process of mending. It was the kind of companionship I hadn't realized I needed. Not to complete me, but to witness me. And I began to trust again, not just people, but time and space, and the possibility of gentleness returning. In August, I went back to my old house, not to move in, not to reclaim anything, but simply to visit. Daniel wasn't there. I had called ahead. We agreed on a time when he'd be out. I walked through the rooms slowly. The furniture was the same. The wallpaper, the smell, the creak of the hallway floor. All so familiar. And yet, I no longer belonged to this space. I could feel it in my bones. In the kitchen, I found my old apron still hanging behind the door. I touched it, worn, soft, and left it there. I took only one thing with me, a framed photo of Thomas and me on our wedding day. It had been on the fireplace mantel for decades. I wanted it in my home now. Before I left, I stood by the door and whispered goodbye. Not to the house, but to the version of myself that had survived there. As fall approached, I began teaching a free writing class at the community center. At first, only a few people came, mostly women, mostly older, mostly quiet. But something happened in that room. As pens moved, stories surfaced about love, about loss, about resilience. We cried together. We laughed. We learned to honor the telling as much as the surviving. One evening, after class, a woman named June said to me, "You're not just healing, Eliza. You're helping others heal, too." And I realized then my story wasn't just about pain. It was about reclaiming. I hadn't just walked away. I had stepped into something new. A life. Daniel and I did eventually speak again over the phone. Then, later, in person. But it was different now. Clear boundaries. No assumptions. No return to the old dynamic. "I understand if you never trust me again," he said once. And I told him the truth. "I don't trust the person you were, but I'm willing to get to know the person you're trying to become." It wasn't a movie ending. There were no grand reunions, no dramatic music, just small, honest conversations. Careful steps. Forgiveness, I learned, doesn't mean pretending the harm never happened. It means letting go of the hope that the past could have been different and choosing peace anyway. And I chose peace. Again and again, every single day. In late September, I attended a workshop at the community center titled Aging with Intention. The flyer caught my eye one day as I passed the bulletin board, and something about the phrase stirred something in me. Not just aging, but aging with intention. As if life, even in its final chapters, could still be full of meaning. The room was filled with people like me, men and women in their 60s, 70s, even 80s, all searching for purpose beyond the roles they had once lived in. Former teachers, caretakers, businesspeople, widows, veterans. Some had children they no longer saw. Others never had families at all. And yet, the yearning in that room was the same: to be more than what we had been told we were allowed to be. The facilitator, a bright, warm woman named Lila, said something that stayed with me. "We are not our regrets. We are what we choose next." That night, I walked home in the crisp autumn air, wind stirring the trees overhead, and I whispered those words to myself again and again. We are what we choose next. It was around this time that I began writing my story, truly writing it, not just in scattered journal entries, but as a complete narrative. For myself, for the women in my class, for anyone who had endured invisible pain and believed they had to stay silent. I rented time in the small library's quiet room and brought my laptop and a thermos of tea. I wrote in the mornings, when my mind was clearest. I cried often, but not always from sorrow, sometimes from release. Telling the truth was like wringing water from cloth that had been soaked too long, slow, messy, but necessary. I wrote about Daniel's birth, how I had waited so long for him, how the nurses had placed his warm little body on my chest, and I had thought, "I will love you forever, no matter what." I wrote about Thomas, the way he made me feel like I could do anything, even when the world said otherwise. I wrote about the garden we had grown, the meals we had shared, the night we danced in the kitchen to old Motown records with flowers still on our hands. And I wrote about the silence that followed him, the years I had spent trying to fill that silence with purpose, pouring everything I had into motherhood, never realizing that one day I'd become invisible in the very life I built. There were days I wanted to stop writing, days when the weight of memory pressed too hard. But I kept going, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for clarity, for freedom, for me. In October, I received a second letter from Daniel. This one shorter, less formal. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about that last phone call. You said you don't trust who I was. That stuck with me. I've been going to therapy every week. It's not easy. I'm learning that I used anger to cover pain, and that's not your burden to carry. It never should have been. I'm not writing to ask you to come back. I just want you to know that I see it now. All of it. What I did. What I didn't do. And I'm sorry again, not because I want something from you, but because you deserve to hear it as many times as you need. I'm proud of you for leaving." Daniel, that line, "I'm proud of you for leaving," undid me. For so long, I had waited for validation. But this was different. This wasn't about him needing me. This was about him, finally, releasing me. I didn't cry this time. I smiled. Not because it fixed everything it didn't, but because it acknowledged what I had survived. It made my reality real. Around Thanksgiving, I was invited to speak at a women's retreat in the next town over. One of the library volunteers had read part of my draft and passed it along to an organizer. They asked if I'd share a portion of my writing, not as a lecturer, but simply as a witness. I was nervous. My hands shook as I stood in front of the microphone, a printed copy of my story in hand. But as I looked out over the room, rows of women, heads tilted in quiet attention, I felt something deep and ancient settle inside me. And I spoke. I told them about the slow erosion of self, the grief that doesn't come with funerals or flowers, but with silence. I told them about the moment I packed my suitcase, about choosing peace over fear, about the miracle of rebuilding at 76. When I finished, there was silence, then applause, but more than that, faces wet with tears, people standing in quiet solidarity. Later, one woman approached me and said, "I didn't know it was okay to leave until you said it out loud." And I realized, My pain had become someone else's permission. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the town, muffling sound, softening everything. I decorated my tiny apartment with pine garlands and a single string of warm yellow lights. Ruth came over for cider. Henry brought me a poinsettia and a new Billie Holiday record. And on Christmas morning, I sat alone by the window, cup of cocoa in hand, and felt peace. Not joy exactly, not the glittering, festive kind, but a deep, warm stillness. A knowing. I had survived. I had grown. And I was home in myself. In early January, Daniel asked if we could meet. We agreed on a public cafe, mid-morning, when the sun was still low but warm through the windows. I wore the soft lavender scarf Ruth had given me, and I arrived 5 minutes early. I didn't shake. I didn't doubt. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. Not because he had changed physically, though he had, but because his eyes no longer held the same walls. He looked older, but also softer. He sat down across from me. We ordered tea, and for a long moment, we just sat. Then he said, "You look well." "I am," I said. "I really am." He nodded. "That makes me happy." There was no script, no clear plan, just two people, both wounded, both trying. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened. We didn't force forgiveness. We simply told the truth. He spoke about his regret. I spoke about my healing. And we parted with a hug, gentle, uncertain, but real. I didn't know if we'd become close again. That wasn't the point. The point was that I had left, and now I had returned, not as the same woman, but as someone whole. Someone who no longer gave her peace away. At my next writing class, I stood before the group and read the final page of my draft. When I finished, there was a quiet, heavy hush in the room. Then one woman, Sarah, raised her hand and said, "Eliza, how did you find the courage to walk away?" I smiled. "It wasn't courage," I said. "Not at first. It was survival. Courage came later when I decided that surviving wasn't enough. I wanted to live. And I could see it in their eyes. Some had walked away already. Some were still gathering the strength. And some were just now realizing they were allowed to dream of more. I left that evening with a heart full of something new. Not just peace. Not just survival. But purpose. The first time I truly felt old was not when I noticed my hands trembling, nor when I forgot the name of a flower I had loved all my life. It was when I realized that I was no longer afraid of time running out. I wasn't chasing it anymore. I had found peace with the ticking. One morning, after my writing class, I stayed behind to organize some of the journals and binders my students left behind. On the back of one notebook, in large, shaky handwriting, someone had written, "It's never too late to begin again." I stared at it for a long while. I had been thinking about legacy, about what would remain after I was gone. Not in the grand sense, not money or property or family name, but something more intimate. The quiet power of surviving, of speaking truth, of walking away and still choosing love. That evening, I sat down at my kitchen table with a fresh notebook and began drafting something I called a letter to the woman who might be me. I wasn't sure what it would become at first, maybe just a few pages. But the words came, one after another, until I found myself building a kind of roadmap, not of answers, but of permission. To the woman who might be me. If you are sitting in silence, afraid to make a sound, know this: you do not need to shrink to be loved. You do not need to accept cruelty just because it comes dressed as family. Love should never feel like a cage. If you are waiting for someone to see your pain, start by seeing it yourself. Give it a name. Hold it in your hands. It is real. You are not imagining it. If you have spent years sacrificing your peace in the name of duty, remember your peace matters too. You are not selfish for wanting to breathe. And if, one day, you find yourself standing at the edge of leaving, suitcase in hand, heart pounding, do not turn back out of guilt. Walk forward. Even if your steps are small, even if they are shaking, they are still yours. You are not abandoning anyone. You are returning to yourself. I ended the letter with a simple line. You are not alone. Because I wasn't. Not anymore. And neither would she be, whoever she was, wherever she lived, whether she was 45 or 85. If she found those words, I hoped they would light the way. The town hosted a storytelling festival that spring. They invited locals to read short essays or memoir excerpts in the public square. Ruth insisted I submit mine. Even just a part, she said. People need to hear from someone who's lived. So I did. The day of the reading, I wore my softest gray sweater, and tucked Thomas's photo into my purse. I stood on a small platform in the town square as the breeze rustled the pages in my hands. My voice trembled only once when I read the line about not needing to shrink to be loved. I saw a young woman in the crowd wipe away tears. Afterward, people came up to speak with me, young women, older men, couples, even teenagers. One teenage girl with purple hair and chipped nail polish simply hugged me without asking and whispered, "I think my grandma needed to hear this before she died." I carried her words with me for days. That summer, I self-published my memoir. Just a small run enough for the library, the community center, a few interested folks from the writing circle. The title came from that very first journal entry I had written the night I stood in the kitchen, broken but awakening. I am not what he says I am. Inside the front cover, I included my letter to the woman who might be me. I didn't care about reviews. I didn't promote it online. But somehow, word spread. People passed it hand to hand, left it in waiting rooms, donated it to shelters, women's centers, senior homes. One day, I received a letter from a woman in Arizona. "Dear Eliza, I found your book in a used bookstore in Tucson. I don't know who left it there, but it found me when I needed it most. I am 67. I left my abusive son last year and have been living in a camper ever since. Some days I wonder if I made a mistake. But your words, especially your letter, reminded me that survival is not a mistake. Thank you for writing it. Thank you for surviving. With gratitude, Darlene." I held that letter in my lap and wept. We live in a world that often forgets women after a certain age, especially women who have lived quietly, behind the curtain, without recognition. But we are here. Our stories matter. Our voices are necessary. And I had become one of them, not forgotten, but found. As I turned 80, Ruth threw me a small birthday gathering. Nothing fancy, just close friends, flowers, homemade cake, and music from a time we still remembered in our bones. Henry gave a toast. "Eliza taught me," he said, "that it is never too late to become yourself, and never too early to forgive yourself." I laughed, tears already in my eyes. And in that small circle of warmth, I looked around and felt, fully, completely, loved, not for what I did, or gave, or endured, but simply for who I was. That was the greatest gift of all. In the final pages of my journal, the one I had started back on the night I first left, I wrote, "Some people will never say sorry. Some will say it too late. Some will mean it, and some won't. But the truth is, healing was never about their apology. It was about me finally choosing myself. If I had stayed, I would have survived. But I wouldn't have lived. And in these final years, I have truly lived in quiet moments, in gentle love, in full breath." One afternoon, Ruth and I sat on her porch, sunflowers blooming wildly in the yard, our teacups balanced on our knees. "I sometimes wonder," she said, "what your younger self would think if she could see you now." I smiled. "She'd be proud," I said. "She'd finally feel safe." And I knew that to be true. I don't know how much time I have left, none of us do. But I know this. I no longer live in fear. I no longer wait for permission. I no longer apologize for needing rest, or softness, or joy. I walked away from a life that was slowly erasing me. And I stepped into one where I am fully, unapologetically me. That is my story. But more than that, that is my legacy.